They chained her to the wagon at dusk, when the sun bowed its burning head, and the wind carried secrets between the mesquite and sage. Her wrists bled under the iron cuff's raw pink skin, scraped open by rust and splinters of rope. Her name was Clara Boone, though some spat the name like it burned their tongue. Witch, they called her, stubborn-blooded witch, for turning down Elijah Finch's proposal. Elijah, the preacher's son turned land baron's pet. She had no father left to speak for her, no brother to fight. Her mother's grave waited 3 miles west, under a crooked pine half-eaten by wind and soil. The town of Bitter Creek had its laws, written in whiskey breath and thin paper signs nailed to posts. But its true law was silencia, hush, that pressed down heavy as iron. A woman says no to a man who owns the biggest herd from here to Abilene? That was treachery. That was witches' talk. They said she'd hex the cattle, sour the milk, wither the wheat, and so they chained her there, arms lashed behind the warped oak wheel of the supply wagon, right in the preacher's yard, so the town could see her shame when they crossed the square come morning. It smelled of old hay, mule, sweat, and kerosene lanterns flickering in window glass. No one came out to her. Even the dogs curled quiet on the porches, tails tucked as if they knew the weight of a woman's refusal. Her dress, once soft calico blue, now torn at the sleeve and stained dark at the shoulder. She kept her head bowed to hide the salt of her tears in the grit of her hair. The night settled cold. Coyotes cried thin across the hills. The preacher's wife peered once through a yellowed curtain, then let it drop. They said it would be sunrise when Elijah arrived with the circuit judge, the rope ready to tie her shame up proper and legal. Maybe they'd brand her cheek. Maybe they'd drag her out past the fences and leave her for the wind. Nobody said for sure. Bitter Creek liked its rumors thick as tar. Yet behind the Black Hills, someone else sat awake with a pipe and a knot of old scars. Silas Drew, they called him, a rancher whose wife had gone to dust 3 winters back. Some said the land broke him. Some said he'd never cared for town justice much anyway. He'd heard the news at the feed store that noon, as a boy whispered about the witch girl chained up. Silas said nothing then, just tipped his hat and walked out slow. But when the stars rose, he saddled his mule and checked the edge of his old bowie knife by candlelight. His boots were split at the heel. His coat smelled of wet horse and ash. He did not pray. He did not promise salvation. All he knew was that no woman deserved iron for saying no. By the wagon, Clara's breath came slow and shallow. Every creak of the wheel reminded her she was still there, awake inside a punishment carved by other people's fear. She mouthed her mother's name, Mary Booniand. The sound rose and died in the raw hush of Bitter Creek. The rope itched against her collarbone where it looped her neck to the axle. Beyond the square, a mule's hoof struck a rock-own heartbeat of warning that maybe, just maybe, dawn would not arrive alone. Silas Drew rode slow through Bitter Creek's sleeping heart, mule's hooves muffled in the hush of dirt and last night's drizzle. He kept to the side alleys where the shadows pooled like ink between clapboard sheds and stacks of dry lumber. The lamp outside McKendry's Mercantile hissed with moth wings, but showed no sign of a watchman. Even the sheriff's window glowed dark. No boots on the porch, no snore behind the half-shut shutters. Silas reckoned the law liked warm beds more than cold rescues. He pulled the brim of his hat low. In his breast pocket lay a folded scrap of linen. Once a kerchief, now just a rag that carried the ghost of lilac oil. His late wife, Ruth, had pressed it to her neck when she braided her hair on Sundays. Some things a man keeps, though he don't talk about why. Maybe tonight it was for luck. Maybe for courage he didn't feel he owned. He tied the mule behind the old blacksmith shed and crept forward, boots whispering over mud and straw. Past the stacked crates, he could see the wagon in the preacher's yard. It loomed large, a lump of battered oak half lit by the pale flicker from the house's back window. And there she was, small, folded in on herself like a rag doll tied to a wheel. He could see the rope cut in at her collar, her wrists blotched dark where the iron bit in. Silas felt a flicker of something ugly in his gootanger, maybe, or shame for the whole sorry town. He dropped to a knee behind a rain barrel, watching, waiting. He counted breaths, the way a man counts fence posts on an endless ride. Steady, dull, endless. He was no Heron ever claimed to be. The war had taken what little taste he had for grand gestures. But seeing Clara Boone bound like a mule for slaughter pulled at something deeper than fear. Inside the preacher's house, a door creaked. Silas froze. The back door swung half open, lantern glow spilling on the yard's packed dirt. The preacher's wife stepped out barefoot, housecoat flapping like a ghost. She carried a tin mug, steam twisting from its lip. She moved to Clara, knelt slow-set the mug by her boots. Clara lifted her head, eyes ringed in dark moons of sleeplessness. Their voices drifted soft on the cold. "You drink, girl," the preacher's wife whispered. "Ain't right this. Ain't right at all." Clara's cracked lips shaped the word why. But no answer came. The woman just touched her shoulder on quick squeeze like a blessing or apology, then turned back inside. She did not untie the rope. She did not shout. She vanished behind the door, latch clicking like the snap of bone. Silas watched Clara sip. Her hands trembled so fierce, half the tin's warm water dripped down her chin, mixing with tears she refused to shed proper. She set it aside and leaned her head back, staring at the blank bowl of sky, stars smudged by drifting cloud. It was time. Silas slid his knife from its sheath, the metal a dull wink in the dawn's first whisper. He rose slow, knees popping like dry twigs. The yard stretched wide and silent. The wagon creaked as Clara shifted her weight, the chains groaning a small complaint into the hush. In that moment, Silas Drew made no vow of heroics. He only told himself, this much-no woman sleeps forever in iron if my hands still work. He stepped from the barrel's shadow, boots sinking quiet in the damp dirt. Dawn pressed its pale shoulder against the edge of Bitter Creek. Somewhere far off, a rooster cracked the hush. Silas moved in. Clara did not flinch when she saw him come. Maybe she'd run out of flinching somewhere between the first insult and the last chain link. Her eyes glowed wide and moonlit, rimmed raw, but she stayed still like prey that's done bargaining with the wolves. Silas knelt by her feet, boots scraping the cold-packed dirt. The rope was older than the wagon, frayed in spots where rain and sun had chewed at its strength. Still, it bit deep enough to keep her anchored like an unwanted secret. Silas pressed a finger to his lips, no words. His knife hovered above the knot, cinched at her neck. Its edge dulled at the tip but keen where it counted. The blade caught the first scrap of rope. He sliced slow, careful not to nick the soft skin beneath. Clara's breath rattled out like she'd been holding it for a lifetime. She did not beg. She did not speak. Her eyes flicked past him, scanning the yard, the porch, the preacher's window that stared at them like an unblinking eye. "You hush," Silas murmured, voice low as the wind through winter grass. "Ain't no call to fret. I got you, girl." It was a lie. He didn't have her. Not really. Not yet. What he had was a blade and a battered mule tied up behind the blacksmith's shed. What he had was a back that ached from too many years bent over fence posts and fire pits, but he let the lie sit between them like a small warmth. The rope fell away with a soft sigh. Clara slumped forward, caught by Silas's free hand, before her face hit the wheel hub. Her wrists were still iron-cuffed to the axle bar. He shifted his weight, working the knife at the rusted lock. The blade slipped, unseskined his knuckle. A hot sting of blood bloomed across his hand, dripping onto the wagon's iron rim. He sucked the breath through his teeth but kept at it, metal scraping metal in the hush. Behind them, the preacher's house creaked. A shutter banged open on the far side. A dog somewhere in town barked a sharp crack in the silence, then nothing. Clara's eyes met his, wild now flecks of mud on her cheek like war paint. "You shouldn't," she rasped, voice dry as brittle reeds. "They'll hang you for this," Silas grunted. "Then best we're gone before the sun's all the way up." The iron hinge gave with a pop like a knuckle, cracked too far back. The cuff clattered against the wheel spoke. Clara hissed when blood returned to her bound hands, red rivers flooding numb fingers. She clenched and unclenched them, breath stuttering with pain that tasted like freedom. Silas wiped the blade on his sleeve, then slipped it back in its sheath. He tugged her up by the elbow gentle as he could manage. She swayed against him, weight feather light but heavy with everything she'd been forced to swallow in silence. "You walk?" he asked. She nodded once. No more words. The preacher's yard spread before them open, moonlit, dangerous. Beyond it lay the alley's breathless dark, the blacksmith shed, the waiting mule. Behind them, the house sighed with old timber and sleeping sin. Silas drew her close, one big hand over her cold wrist. Her pulse thudded frantic under his thumbproof. She was still alive, still fighting, even if her voice was ragged. Together they stepped into the yard's open throat, dawn whispering at their backs, the world too still to trust. They did not run yet. Running made noise. They moved like ghosts, soft, careful, unblessed by anyone but the hush between the stars. And in the preacher's window, a flicker of curtain, a child's face, half seen, eyes wide as if a secret had slipped through the walls. A crack in the town's silence, small but waiting to grow. They reached the edge of the preacher's yard, just as the sky bruised from ink to pearl. Silas felt Clara's weight lean harder against him, her legs, remembering how to move under her shame. Her breath short like she'd run a mile, though they'd barely crossed 20 paces. His mule, an old sorrel named Whiskey, stamped the cold dirt behind the blacksmith's shed, ears flicking at every stray whisper of dawn. Silas checked the street. Bitter Creek still slept, but sleep here was the restless, kind neighbors, peeking through cracks, telling themselves they saw nothing. Somewhere, a rooster crowed again, bold and useless. Time was snapping its fingers at their heels. He swung Clara up behind the mule's saddle. She winced at the touch but didn't fight. Her hands, red and raw from the iron, gripped the blanket roll behind the saddle horn. Silas steadied her knee. With a gloved palm felt the tremor run up her bone like a hidden wire. He swung up in front, boots creaking in the stirrups that hadn't seen oil in weeks. Whiskey snorted, turned one ear back like he knew trouble when it crawled up his spine. Silas clucked his tongue and patted the mule's thick neck. "Easy, boy. Easy." Clara's voice, small and scraped thin, came near his shoulder. "Where will you take me?" Silas didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the narrow path behind the cooper's shop-own last slip of shadow before the main street. "Out past Dead Man's Hollow. I got a lean-to yonder. You'll rest there." He didn't say if. He didn't say if we make it. Some words didn't belong in a mouth already cracked by lies and half-hope. He nudged Whiskey forward. The mule stepped slow at first, hooves soft in the muck, but the dawn pushed at their spines like an impatient hand. Clara pressed her face against the back of Silas's coat. He felt her breath warm through the worn canvas, wet and shivery, like a ghost's last whisper. They slipped behind the cooper's shop, past stacked barrels smelling of old pitch and sweet rot. The wind cut through the alley sharp and mean, tugging at Clara's torn sleeve. A memory flickered behind Silas's eyes. Ruth, his wife, standing in this same alley once, her skirt hem tangled in the mud, laughing at some half-drunk joke he'd told before the war, took his good years and better friends. He buried it, buried her. Now this girl's breath on his back clawed it back up. They turned onto the back path to the creek's edge. Here the ground dipped soft, wagon ruts frozen in ridges like old scars. The sun clawed higher streaks of pink and brass bleeding into the night's last hush. Behind them, the preacher's house was waking. A door slammed. A voice, sharp and cracked. "She's gone, Lord! She's gone!" Then more voices, men stumbling into boots, rifles rattling against porch rails, the slow rising growl of a town remembering it had a throat. Whiskey picked up his pace without urging. Clara clung tighter, chin tucked against Silas's shoulder blade. He could hear her pulse in the way she breathed, dragged but stubborn. Ahead, the trail split-toned path back to town, the other west to Dead Man's Hollow. Silas leaned into the saddle horn, whispered in the mule's ear like a prayer. "Not today, old boy, not today." Behind them a shout rang out, Elijah's voice, sour and spoiled. Bring her back here." Boots hit the mud. A dog barked itself hoarse. The dawn cracked wide open. Silas Drew, who'd buried his wife and half his pride in the dust, kicked his mule's ribs gentle but firm. Whiskey lunged forward, hooves striking sparks where rock bit through the frost. The wind whipped back Clara's hair, tangled and wild as freedom's first scream. They were out. Not safe, not yet, but out. The trail to Dead Man's Hollow curved like a bent finger through the low hills and stunted cottonwoods. By the time Bitter Creek's shouting faded behind them, the sun had cracked the horizon wide, spilling thin gold across frost-bitten sage. The air tasted of iron and ash like old bullets left to rust under rain. Clara pressed her forehead to Silas's back. Each hoofbeat jarred her raw wrists against the blanket roll, but she made no sound, swallowed every hiss and whimper like a vow. She'd given the town enough of her voice, they wouldn't have the rest. Her knees clenched the mule's flanks, keeping her upright when her mind drifted to sleep that never came. Silas kept his eyes forward. The land here knew him-bitter flats, dry stream beds, deer trails tangled through hoya, and ghost grass. He'd buried fence posts along this stretch back when Ruth still hummed hymns to the stove's rattle. He could ride it blind, and half did memory guiding the reins when sight blurred behind thoughts he'd rather drown. He felt Clara shift, her breath ragged like paper tearing. "Why'd you come for me?" she asked, voice catching in the wind. It wasn't thanks. It was accusation, curiosity, disbelief all tangled like burrs in her throat. Silas's jaw worked side to side before he answered. "Didn't figure you owed them iron for saying no. That simple?" She almost left Dan. Ugly sound, raw and splintered. He grunted, "Simple's all I got left." A magpie flitted across the trail, wings flashing ink and silver. Clara watched it vanish into the brush-free, thoughtless, no collar around its throat. Her wrists burned where the rope had kissed her skin too long. The taste of rust and old tears stuck to the back of her tongue. They crested a low rise where the land split open a dry wash, then a bluff of shale crowned with stunted juniper. At the bottom, tucked under stone like a secret, lay Silas's lean-to, a tangle of logs, old canvas, and a stone-ringed fire pit. No door, no lock, just enough roof to keep the wind off a tired man's bones. Silas swung down first, boots crunching over last year's leaves. He turned, hands steady as he lifted Clara down. She winced when her feet touched ground legs, stiff, blood fighting its way back into half-dead muscles. He guided her to a flat stone near the pit. "Sit," he said. Not in order, not gentle either, just a word like fence wire, plain and necessary. Clara obeyed. She pressed her palms against the cold stone to anchor herself to something that wouldn't move, wouldn't betray her with whispered lies of safety. She watched him kneel by the pit, strike flint to tinder until smoke curled up to meet the sky's pale belly. His shoulders moved slow, careful, like a man who'd learned the hard way that sudden gestures could spook a horse or a ghost. When the fire caught, Silas leaned back on his haunches. He dug a battered tin cup from his saddlebag, poured her the last of his water. She drank slow, drips tracing her chin, washing grit and blood from cracked lips. "You got family left?" he asked, eyes on the flame. She shook her head. "Graveyard's got all that." Silas nodded on seno pity. No sermon. Just a fact laid next to hers, kindling for the hush that settled between them. In the brush, a coyote barked a single note, sharp and lonesome. Clara flinched. Silas did not. He leaned forward, feeding the fire until it snapped and popped, bright enough to remind them both they were not yet ghosts in this dry-boned country. Behind them, somewhere back along the trail, Bitter Creek was stirring like a hornet's nest. But here, in Dead Man's Hollow, for the briefest blink, they held something that felt like a breath unchained. They sat by the fire until the sun hauled itself clear above the bluff, spreading weak warmth through the hollow's ribs. Clara tucked her hands under her thighs to hide the bruises, the rope burns gone to angry welts. Silas laid a strip of jerky and half a dry biscuit near her knee. She eyed them like a stray dog, hunger at war with pride. "Eat," he said, voice scraped down to a low drawl. "Ain't poison." She took the biscuit, broke off a piece, chewed slow. Each bite scratched her raw throat, but reminded her teeth they still had work to do. She didn't thank him. Gratitude felt like a shackle some days. Silas turned a stick through the fire, shifting embers, coaxing sparks to dance up into the pale sky. When he spoke, he didn't look at her. "They'll come for you. Elijah Finch ain't a man to let go of a thing he claims is his, least of all a woman who says he ain't." "I know." Clara's voice barely rose above the wind. "He'll come with the judge, or with the sheriff, if he can find him sober." Silas almost smiled. "Sheriff's got no fight in him. Never did." He jabbed the stick deeper into the coals. The end glowed mean, bright as a dying star. Clara's eyes tracked the brand of heat. It flickered memories through her memories of a rumor hissed through Bitter Creek's saloon doors. "Mark her cheek if she says no. Let every man know she's spoiled, a witch, a troublemaker." The town didn't want a woman to walk away untouched. Shame was the leash they trusted most. Silas pulled the stick from the fire. The tip sizzled in the cold air, smoke curling off it in lazy twists. He met her stare for the first time in full daylight, his eyes a washed-out blue, hard at the edges but soft where they landed on her throat. You know they mean to mark you. It wasn't a question. He didn't flinch when she didn't nod. So, we mark you first. Our way. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a battered tin of lampblack he used to mend harness cracks. He popped the lid with a thumb, the black paste glinting dull as a crow's wing. Clara watched his hand, wary. You trust me? Silas asked. She didn't answer. But she didn't flinch either when he dipped 2 fingers in the black and pressed them gentle to her cheekbone right where a brand would go. His touch was rough skin scraped by years of mending fence wire and burying the dead. But the way he dabbed the mark felt careful, like a father pressing dirt over a fresh seed. He stepped back to study his work, a single black slash under her left eye. Not a burn, not a wound. A promise. This says you're yours, he said. This says Bitter Creek can't have what you ain't giving. Clara lifted trembling fingers, touched the mark. A breath like a prayer slipped her lips, just air, just sound, but more honest than any sermon. The shame they'd planned for her burned away in that hush, fed to the crackling fire. Somewhere above the bluff, a hawk wheeled lazy in the brightening sky. Clara followed it with her eyes, the wind tugging her hair back from her face, a new skin beneath old hurt. Silas turned back to the fire, fed it a scrap of old rope he'd cut from her neck. The fibers curled, blackened, turned to ash, the symbol of her shame gone to dust under a cold blue heaven. Down the trail, Bitter Creek's dogs were barking again. Elijah Finch would not be far behind. But for this heartbeat, just this one, Clara Boone's face belonged to her alone. By noon, the hollow's hush broke under the distant snap of hoofbeats. Elijah's men, maybe half a dozen if Silas guessed the rhythm right. No lawmen worth their tin star, just hired grit with dry throats and loud guns. The wind carried their voices in scraps. Track went west. She's his now, preacher says. The usual poison, coiled in words they'd spit out the moment they got close enough to smell her fear. Clara sat on the flat stone, shoulders squared against the bluff shadow. She'd scrubbed her face raw at the creek's trickle, but the lampblack slash still clung to her cheekbone, smudged yet stubborn. She caught Silas watching her while he packed up the lean-to's scant storage, a sack of beans, stale bread, a dented flask of whiskey he'd meant to save for winter fevers. You think we can outrun them? She asked. Not panic, not hope either. Just a question like flint on steel. Silas cinched the bedroll to Whiskey's saddle. Not outrun, he said. Out. Think. He pressed a short-barreled revolver into her palm. The grip was warm from his coat pocket, the iron snub-nosed and older than her. Clara weighed it like a stone she might skip across water if the world were gentler. I've never, she began. Point it steady, Silas said, voice low but cutting through her doubt like an axe. If a man comes too close, you pull. Don't think past that. He said it plain. He did not lace it with promises of safety or the lie of mercy. In this country, mercy got a woman chained to a wagon for saying no. Clara let the weight settle her wrist bones. The rope burned still fresh ghosts under her skin. They heard the riders cresting the bluff snorts of tired horses, the clink of spurs. Silas checked the lean-to's brush wall one last time, making sure nothing gave them away too quick. He caught Clara's eyeshores, dark and sharp now under the mark he'd painted. You trust me yet? He asked, voice barely a whisper. She set the revolver in her lap, fingers light on the trigger guard. No, she said, but the way she looked at him like she'd stitched a sliver of her hope into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking, made him believe trust didn't need saying. The riders came into view, 6 men, dust on their hats, eyes like coin slots. Elijah rode front astride a sleek chestnut gelding he'd stolen fair and square from a neighbor who owed him too much money. His coat flapped open, boots polished even for a dawn chase. He looked like a man who thought the world owed him obedience, and wouldn't mind taking it by rope if obedience proved scarce. Silas stepped clear of the lean-to's brush, arms loose at his sides. Clara stayed back, hidden behind the stone shoulder, breath shallow but even. The revolver rested on her knee, hammer cocked halfway, like a rattlesnake deciding when to strike. Silas Drew, Elijah called, smile cutting wide under his bristled mustache. Ain't seen you in church since your wife's box went under. Silas shrugged. God knows my mind fine from here. Elijah's grin twisted. You got something belongs to me. Silas's hands stayed empty, boots braced in the dirt. Don't reckon she ever did. One of Elijah's men left a cracked sound, raw like a split knuckle. The others shifted in their saddles, eyes flicking to the bluff's brush. They smelled the tension like dry lightning, ready to spark tinder. Silas spoke soft, meant for Clara's ears more than Elijah's swagger. When ash flies, blood follows. You remember that. Behind the rock, Clara did not tremble. She pressed the revolver's nose to the stone's edge steady, quiet, unclaimed. The rope that once pinned her down now smoked and sifted into the wind behind them, a promise that wouldn't burn her twice. And as Elijah's gelding pawed the earth, the first coil of defiance unspooled in the Husha stand, that wouldn't bow, not to law, not to rumor, not to any man who thought a woman's no could be shackled to a wagon's wheel forever. The bluff seemed to hold its breath as Silas and Elijah locked eyes across the brittle stretch of dry grass and cold stone. Clara could taste the dust rising off the horses like old pennies in the back of her throat when she'd been chained too long to breathe right. She pressed her palm to the rock, revolver wedged against the curve of her knee. Her heartbeat drummed through her shoulder, her cheek, the raw line where the lampblack mark said a mark that didn't sting like shame but like armor. Elijah leaned forward in his saddle, boots creaking, spurs brushing his gelding's flank. His grin was all teeth, all pretty preacher's son gone to rot behind easy coin and a coward's charm. Step aside, Drew, or you'll find your bones buried right next to your wife's cold bed. Silas didn't flinch. He just breathed slow, like he was counting fence posts again, or the steady ring of a hammer striking hot iron on an anvil. Ain't no grave deep enough to keep me down today, Finch. One of the riders to Elijah's left, a boy not much older than 16, cheeks still trying to catch up with the gun strapped to his hip, shifted nervously. His horse sidestepped, hooves clacking stones down into the wash. Clara watched him closest. Boys made mistakes men sometimes wouldn't. Boys fired because they were afraid to be seen not firing. Elijah lifted his chin. Bring her out. I'll have her branded proper, chained to my barn door till she learns how to say yes. A cold breeze slipped down the bluff, lifting the ends of Clara's hair where it stuck to the sweat at her nape. She felt her stomach turn over, acid biting her tongue, but she swallowed it back down. Her finger found the trigger's curve. Silas caught the shift-a-flick of the corner of his eye. He gave her nothing else, no nod, no sign. Just trust, stitched tight into the hush between them. Step aside, Drew, Elijah repeated, voice rising thin and sharp as a preacher's whip. Last chance. Silas rolled his shoulders. Ain't yours to take. The boy on the left twitched. His hand slipped to his holster, knuckles bone white in the dawn light. Clara sucked air through her teeth, squinted down the iron sight like she'd seen her father do once before he died, coughing blood on a farm the bank stole. Time cracked. The boy's hand cleared leather. The revolver's hammer dropped. Two sounds split the Husha shot, sharp and mean. Then the mule's startled bray behind the lean-to. Clara's wrist bucked back with a recoil, the gun's bite punching her palm raw. The boy toppled sideways out of his saddle, hat spinning like a wheel blown loose in a prairie wind. His horse screamed, bolted upslope. Elijah's face turned pale and flat preacher's mask gone. Monster's sneer underneath. He wheeled his gelding sideways, yanked his pistol free. Silas was faster boots planted wide, his own revolver barking once, twice. Sparks flicked off the bluff's rock wall as lead found timber and flesh. One of Elijah's hired grit toppled backward, boot hooked in a stirrup, dragged squealing downslope. Smoke coiled through the hollow, thin as the prayers Bitter Creek had forgotten to say for Clara Boone. She ducked behind the stone, breath hammering her ribs. Her thumb scraped the revolver's hammer backblood on her lip, where she'd bitten through her own fear. Silas reloaded, every click of brass in the cold like a drumbeat that said, "Not today. Not for her. Not for you." He moved closer to Clara's rock, the fire pit's ash swirling around his boots like ghosts dancing in the dawn. Above it all, Elijah's voice cracked now, desperate. "You think this ends here, Drew? You think you can keep her?" Silas spoke without turning. He spoke for Clara to hear, for the wind to carry down into the town's gossip gutters. "She ain't mine to keep. She's hers to walk away." And over the bluff's edge, the hawk wheeled again, watching this sorry patch of earth where chains turned to ash and a girl's no found its teeth. The smoke from the gunfire drifted low over the hollow, catching in Clara's hair, stinging her eyes until they watered rivers down the black slash on her cheek. Her palm throbbed, where the revolver's grip had bucked against the rope burns still healing raw. She tasted gunpowder at the back of her throat, metallic. Hot proof that saying no could sing louder than any sermon if a woman aimed true. Elijah pulled his gelding in a tight circle, eyes wide like a trapped boar's. The preacher's golden boy, spit clean and righteous in town, looked nothing holy now, hair plastered, damp to his temple, pistol trembling in his hand. Another of his men dragged himself away from the fire's edge, a graze tearing his coat sleeve. He spat blood into the dust and didn't bother to stand again. Silas stepped half in front of Clara's stone, his boots braced, shoulders squared, gun barrel steady. He didn't look back at her, but she knew the hinge of this stand didn't swing without her finger on that second bullet, still waiting in the cylinder. "You lay that gun down, Drew," Elijah barked, voice cracking raw over the sound of his horse's restless hooves. "You ain't walking out of this hollow. I got half the town riding down behind me." Silas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. More like a ghost of one what a man wore when the graveyard already counted him once. "Then best you kill me clean, Finch, 'cause you'll never see her chained again." Clara shifted, knees numb on the cold stone. Her knuckles whitened on the revolver, the steel cold enough to bite through the pulse in her wrist. In her mind, she saw the wagon wheel, the rope, the iron, the soft hush of her mother's grave under the pine. All the yeses she'd been told she owed men with money and iron and teeth for smiles. She would not owe any more. Elijah kicked his gelding forward, trying to swing around the bluff's shoulder. The horse snorted, hooves slipping on loose shale. He raised the pistol, thumb on the hammer, eyes locked past Silas, past the fire pit, straight at her. Like if he killed the breath in her chest, the rope would appear again, his order restored by bullet and threat. Silas didn't move. His gun tracked Elijah's belly, steady as winter frost on dry grass. Clara exhaled once. Slow. She rose from her crouch behind the stone, boots crunching over the cold dust. The revolver's nose lifted, sight lined with the bright brass buttons on Elijah Finch's Sunday coat. She tasted salt on her lip sweat. Fear. Memory. "No more," she whispered. Not a scream. Not a plea. Just enough for the wind to carry back down the trail, where a child's voice might tell another story of how a woman once stood unshackled. Elijah's eyes widened, surprise, rage, something soft and ugly like disbelief. He turned his gun toward her. The bluff held its breath again. Clara pulled the trigger. The shot cracked sharp, louder than her heart this time. The bullet punched through Elijah's shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. His pistol fired wide, lead splintering into the bluff's rock, nowhere near Silas, nowhere near Clara's skin. The gelding screamed under him, hooves churning the slope to panic. Elijah toppled backward, boots tangling in stirrups, his preacher's promises scattering in the dust and the shale. His gun dropped from his slack, fingers sooseless now as the rope back in Bitter Creek Square. Silas lowered his revolver but didn't holster it yet. He turned, just enough to meet Clara's eyes. Her hands were shaking, her knees too, but her spine stayed straight. "You done?" he asked. She nodded, breath ragged. Done with him. Behind them, the last of Elijah's hired grit spurred his horse away. No more pay worth dying for in this dry hollow. The wind rose up, tugged at the ash, and the footprints carried the gunsmoke east toward Bitter Creek's waking hush. Silas stepped to her side. For a moment he didn't touch her. Just let the dawn pour over them two shapes framed by stone and fire and the black smear of what they'd buried in this place. A woman's no had cut its rope at last. They stayed there until the wind laid down its last whisper through the hollow long enough for the echoes of gunfire to bleed into the hills, swallowed by sage and shale and the ragged hush that only wide country knows. Clara set the revolver on the stone beside her, its cylinder empty, but its weight still pressed into her palm like a question she'd never asked before. What now, when the chain is ash and the rope is gone? Silas moved slow to the edge of the bluff, boots creaking over dry shale, eyes on the trail that curved back to Bitter Creek like an old scar across his life. He half expected to see a fresh posse cresting the rise, but no one came. The town would find its excuses soon enough. Preachers' whispers, hush money. A new sign nailed crooked to the church door. They'd tell it how they needed to sleep at night. But not her story. Not hers. Behind him, Clara wiped the last of the lampblack from her cheek with her sleeve. The mark he'd painted was gone now, but the ghost of it stayed stitched to her ribs like a fresh seam that no iron could burn out. She stood slow, feeling her knees protest, her wrists flaring where rope had taught her the price of no. She flexed her fingers, winced at the sting, and didn't shy from it. Pain made her know she'd lived through it all. Silas turned back, watched her gather herself up like a stray fire ember still burning, just quieter now that dawn claimed the sky. He cleared his throat like he meant to speak, but words got stuck in that place where a man's pride wrestles his grief. Clara helped him finish. "You'll stay here?" He nodded. "Ain't much back there worth my boots." She scanned the lean-to, the ashes of the rope buried in the fire pit, the prints they'd left in the dirter record no judge could stamp out. "I'll go west," she said. Her voice cracked but didn't break. "Past the hollow. Maybe to my uncle's place. Maybe further." He lifted an eyebrow. "You trust kin?" She half smiled. Small, sad, but real. "Don't trust anyone," Silas drew. "But I trust my feet more than a wagon wheel." He let out a laugh, the sound rusted by years, but warmer than any blessing Bitter Creek had ever offered him. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled free a scrap of Ruth's old kerchief, the lilac oil long gone but its shape still soft as memory. He held it out, thumb smoothing the edge, like he might smooth old regrets. "You take this," he said. "Road's cold. World's colder. But you keep it tight to your throat. It'll remind you you don't bow for no man's rope again." Clara took it, felt its ghost weight settle across her raw wrists. A promise, a scar that didn't bleed. She tucked it into her bodice, close to the mark that Bitter Creek had wanted branded on her skin forever. Now it was hers, and no one else's. She turned toward the trail, one foot in front of the other, boots scraping over frost-bitten sage. When she crested the bluff's edge, she looked back and saw Silas by the dying fire, smoke winding around his shoulders like Ruth's ghost come to rest. He raised a hand, palm out. No wave, no farewell, just a man bearing witness that she was leaving on her own feet, free in the same world that tried to break her. Clara Boone vanished over the ridge as the first hawk's cry split the brightening sky. Below, Bitter Creek would wake to the wagons and the gossip and the preacher's new lie. But up here in Dead Man's Hollow, a woman's no still echoed unburned, unbranded, alive. And somewhere under that bluff's lean shadow, buried in the ash where rope once wrapped a girl's throat, a single stone stayed behind, smooth, palm-sized, dark from the fire's kiss. She'd pressed it there herself before she left her mark, her grave of the old chain. A scar left standing, so the wind could tell it true when the hush settled again. And so the tale sits by the fire, waiting for whoever needs its warmth next.